Welcome today to Spook by Spending Plans. This is our third webinar for the 2026 Get Savvy, Grow Your Green Stuff webinar series. We've been doing this for a long time, and we like to do this Halloween-themed spooky webinar around Halloween time to talk about our financial fears and how to address them with our spending plans. My name is Andrea Pellegrini, and I run the University of Illinois Systems Student Money Management Center out of University of Bursar. And I'm joined today by my colleagues, Nikki and Kimber. Nikki, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Nikki Jancola Shanks, and I am the policy director for Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton.
Thank you, Nikki. Kimber is going to be in the chat with a couple of my students, Emmy and Sahil, and they're going to be monitoring what's going on in the chat. Like I said, we use that chat a lot. So if you have questions, you can put it in the chat, or we have also turned on the Q&A feature if you would prefer to ask anonymously. And we'll also be using some polls today. Collectively, the Get Savvy team represents organizations across the state of Illinois, which rest on the land of multiple Native nations, including the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasha nations. And we have a responsibility to acknowledge these Native nations and work with them towards a more vibrant and inclusive society. So we're going to kick off the first poll with a little demographics questionnaire. This lets us know who's joining us. If you're associated with one of the universities, it tells us which one you are associated with, just so we can keep track of that. I have a lot of partners across the University of Illinois system and state, so that's why that helps us out. We can also cater some of our examples that Nikki and I will talk about today based on some of these demographics. So knowing your age range and kind of where you're coming from with respect to kind of whether you're a student or full-time employee can help us better address some common questions around financial planning and budgeting related to that. So it looks like a lot of folks are from Urbana. We have all across the age ranges represented today. Lots of students, but also a lot of full-time employees. Looks like mostly women on today, which is great. And then we have a pretty diverse race and ethnicity. So it looks like about half of you have participated so far. I'll give you a couple more seconds, and then we will move on to our learning objectives. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. I'll share the results real quick, and we're going to stop sharing. So if that box is still up, you can exit out of it, and the next poll should pop up when I launch it. So we're planning to cover several different topics today to help you or your loved ones overcome financial fears or anxieties and hopefully help you take better control of your money. So we're going to be talking about some of those common financial fears that lead to budgeting avoidance or financial avoidance. We're also going to talk a little bit about some of the psychological and emotional factors related to financial habits, but we're also going to be talking about some of the technical aspects of financial planning, including how to identify different expenses, how to track them, what circumstances might come into play when you're trying to define and understand how your spending behaviors function. We're also going to talk about how to reduce some financial anxiety through more financial clarity. That's why we're going to focus a lot on expense tracking and budgeting methodologies. We're also going to talk about a little bit personality inventories and how your personal values kind of drive all of your financial decisions, as it does with most of our behaviors. And then we'll describe a couple ways to reprioritize spending to meet your changing needs, because things change very rapidly while you're in school, but right now everything changes quite a bit. So that will be helpful for you to understand what options you have. All right, so I'm going to launch another poll. We're going to talk about financial fears because this is a spooky Halloween webinar, right? So there are a lot of obstacles that make it difficult to create a spending plan or a budget. So think about what might make spending plans scary or uncomfortable for you. So we have a question in our little poll if you have a budget or not. A lot of you do, but most of you don't so far. But there are a lot of fears that are related to this. So talking about and or thinking about money itself can bring up all kinds of emotions and even fearful ones, right? But we don't really know how to overcome those fears until we identify kind of what is causing them. So this is like the first step. So for example, a lot of people associate numbers with math, right? And math with spending plans. So uh, about 93% of adult Americans report experiencing some level of math anxiety, with as much as 17% suffering from high levels of math anxiety. And if math is a barrier to overcoming the fears related to budgeting or spending plans, then that's something to address. But the nice thing about budgeting and spending plans is that it's really more behavioral than it is math. And we have a lot of tools that can help us out with both. So I am going to end the poll right now and just share the results real quick. So for those of you that might be listening to this recording later or watching the recording later, you probably won't see the poll, but about half of our attendees today have a plan, which is great. And we also have a lot of different fears in these categories. There's a lot of people are suffering from the fear of facing financial realities, like not being able to reach their goals, like retirement or affording emergencies, or there just won't be enough money for all of the financial responsibilities that are laid out there. Some people fear not being able to keep up with their family or friends, which is a common reality for many folks. There's a lot of people that lack financial confidence and knowledge, but luckily you're here. And that is one of the steps to gaining financial confidence is gaining some knowledge. So we are going to do what we can to address that one. And then there are a lot of people that just don't see that there's enough money to justify making a financial plan, so they rather avoid thinking about it. That's pretty common, especially in students. And then a lot of people might feel anxiety or shame around math anxiety or budgets and just feeling overwhelmed, like it's too much to tackle at once. And so there are different ways to kind of approach those things. So I'll stop sharing those results. So in order to kind of empower your financial planning, we need to acknowledge that there's an emotional and psychological side of financial behaviors and not just talk about the logistics. Sometimes there are real barriers to overcome in order to take action. So to make financial planning a little bit easier, we can do things like breaking tasks into smaller steps, which makes them a little bit less scary or overwhelming. We might view expense tracking more as data than judgment. A lot of people feel like expense tracking might make them feel shame because they're more aware of their habits, but we're just gathering data. And then we can make more informed choices about the realities of our situations. And then we might also need to recognize that small amounts and steps add up. So sometimes financial planning requires behaviors that are not really related to spending or saving. It might be like, I need to make a list of um, things that I own for my insurance, right? And so that can be overwhelming sometimes. So here are just a few ways that we can think about empowering financial plans. So the other thing we want to acknowledge is that finances aren't just about budgets and they're not just about things within our control. So there are a lot of external factors that influence the decisions that we make. Things like our socioeconomic status, our geography, all those things can impact our access to financial tools and choices that are available to us. And there's unexpected events that can also influence the context of our decisions. So we don't really make financial decisions or any decisions in a vacuum, and we need to acknowledge that. And we're going to talk about some strategies for managing what is in our control today. And some of that may require more drastic changes to your lifestyle, but we also need to recognize that there's a lot of things outside of our control that we may need to keep in mind as we make our financial plans. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Nikki.
Hello. So we're going to start by picturing your spending plan. And in order to visualize your spending plan and to make sure it turns into reality, there are a few concepts that we're going to kind of go over. So spending plan versus budget. The word budget sometimes makes people feel trapped or very restricted, and that itself can be scary. So what are the differences between budget and spending plans? Well, they're essentially the same thing, but you are shifting the emphasis onto the planning, and that helps you take control of your finances by developing goal focused strategies to address your different spending priorities. Budgets have historically been thought of as very prescriptive and unforgiving, and you have to follow it exactly. But your spending plan should actually be flexible because, as Andrea was just talking about, your priorities, goals, resources, expenses change. And then so should your spending plan change based on those life changes. So a spending plan's goal is really to empower you to control where your money is going. All right, so what is in a typical spending plan? One is your income. So these are the three main priorities: income, expenses, and goals. So the what to consider for each of those. So an income is obviously you think about your paycheck, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about what goes into your paycheck and different income and stuff later. Especially because a lot of people experience income volatility, and the amount of pay that you may receive varies, and that can make planning and reaching your goals a little bit more challenging. So you want to also think about there's other sources of income besides just your paycheck. Then expenses, accounting for your expenses can be complicated because there are three main types. There's fixed, so those are expenses that don't change month to month, week to week. Flexible, so they may change according to, for example, your grocery bill may fluctuate, right? It's a flexible thing. Or occasional cost. You may have a particular payment to be a part of some association for school or something like that, that's only a one-time expense or quarterly. And then there's also the cost of living that needs to be taken into. Your cost of living varies from one place to another. And so if you move, you may need to take into account all of your other, all of the new expenses. There are a lot of different expense tools, tracking tools out there, and sometimes that itself can be very overwhelming because there's so many different, and you kind of need to experiment to find one that might work for you. And then what are your goals? Your goals are really the heart of your budget. It should give your spending direction and focus. But it can also be challenging to set realistic goals for saving money or paying down debt. So we're also going to talk about SMART goals. And I just want to make sure we wanted to hammer home to you guys to give yourself some grace when things don't go exactly as you planned. All right, so I mentioned we were going to talk about income sources. So when you think about creating a budget, a spending plan, the first guideline you think of is probably how much your salary or wages are. Maybe you think in what your take home pay is after taxes. However, there's other sources out there, such as healthcare, SNAP, FAFSA, community assistance like libraries or public transit, food pantries, and shelters. There also, you may have some gifts, right? Gift cards are oftentimes forgotten about, or if you have your birthday's coming up, you get different cash. So when you sit down to think about it, your income sources might be more than just your paycheck. However, but when you do sit down to create your spending plan, the best starting point is to think about all your resources, and you should start with your wages. I mentioned it before, but make sure you're looking at your take-home pay as opposed to your overall salary, depending on your job, your overall salary. That way your take-home pay it removes taxes. It removes if you have health insurance that's being taken out or anything else that may be taken out of your paycheck. So the other important thing is to make sure that if you have several jobs, you're adding up your totals to get a clear picture of how much money you are earning per month to base your spending plan on. Income volatility. There's been a lot of research over the years, but it is a term that's used to describe income dips and spikes over a relatively short period of time. It's typically defined as a 25% or more change in income annually. But a lot of contract workers or hourly employees could describe income volatility by pay period or project. And if you are a low income earner, even a 10% change week to week or month to month may be very dramatic. Frequent income changes can cause a lot of anxiety, and sometimes budgeting increases awareness of that anxiety. But there are ways to cope with it, especially if you think broadly and flexibly about your income and your resources. One thing that we just want to highlight here is your tricky income. Student loans, if you are currently in school, you may be getting that money from your student loans and using it for some of your expenses right now. However, keep in mind that this is the type of income that you want to minimize, because it is debt and it does have to be repaid later. Don't rely on student loan forgiveness to magically wipe away all of your student loan debt. In most loan forgiveness programs, you do have to still make minimum payments for so many years before the rest of the debt is forgiven. So it's still a type of debt you want to minimize. However, it may be helpful in covering costs while you're in school. We have many student loan programs and special things. So make sure you register for our student loan update webinar series. I think our next one's in April or May, I believe.
It is in April, and Kimber, who's in the chat, is working on a podcast to come out later this week or early next week, specifically on all the changes to student loans that we've experienced in the past several months and years, I guess. But we're summarizing it all in one episode.
So understanding your expenses, just know that expenses are not all one size fits all. There are many ways to categorize your expenses, and you have to do what works best for you. Your needs versus wants may vary. So a need is something that you absolutely need, and if you went without it, it would impact your health, your safety, or your livelihood. A want is just something that would be nice to have that you want. Every individual person's needs versus wants will also vary. As Andrea mentioned earlier, your values often dictate priorities. So what's important to you is not the same as what's important to somebody else when it comes to their money. And then again, cost of living varies. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but on the next slide. But depending where you live, your cost of living and therefore the needs category may be very different between where you go. So this is a slide that kind of shows you the cost of living expenses by location. Depending where you live and what lifestyle choices you make, living expenses can vary greatly. Utilities are also another living expense to consider and budget for. Lights, water, electricity, parking, gas, trash fees, and maintenance fees are all items that can be bundled in with your utility budget. So you make sure you don't find yourself in the dark. You will find that the majority of your coursework is probably going to be online. So you will need to decide if you can afford to have internet, if that's the case for you in your school, where you live, shop. So then you may need to shop around for the best deal. And then don't forget about rent. Rent is usually paid on a monthly basis to a landlord. And depending on your situation, getting a roommate that you can live with and get along with may be a good option for you. So those are by location. You could see the vast changes depending where you live. Another cost of living example, this is the average rent. Your average rent varies both by where you live, both from a municipality perspective, as well as where within that municipality you choose to live. It could also be the amount of bedrooms, what available extras may be offered in your apartment building. So this graph shows the average rent prices, and they could vary from $500 a month to over $4,000 a month across Illinois, depending on where you live and the number of bedrooms in the rental property. All right, so inflation. Inflation can be very complicated topic, and there are lots of ways that it can be measured, and different industries can be affected by inflation at different rates. Inflation is something that obviously would impact a spending plan. So if you want to learn more about that, about inflation and what that impacts, you could either go to our previous webinar or the Making Sense of Money podcast series on economic indicators. Now I will turn that back over to Andrea.
Thank you so much, Nikki. So let's talk about tracking expenses. How do you currently track your spending? Do you do it by just online banking, reviewing what's in your account? Do you do it by physically writing everything down? Do you use a mobile app? There's tons of different mobile apps out there that can kind of help you with tracking your expenses. With apps and even online banking, every tool has different features that you may want or you may want to make sure are not available if you don't want them, depending on your preferences. So some may have you be able to connect all of your different accounts at different financial institutions. Some are going to be free or ad supported, and some might be paid. So there's a lot of different tools out there. It looks like a lot of people use online banking, Excel, Google Sheets to track bills and due dates. These are all really great tools. There's tons of really great tools out there. If you want to share what works best for you or how you have changed in your approach to tracking expenses over time, please share in the chat. We have a tight timeline and we are a little bit behind, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward. So when it comes to expense tracking, I really want to emphasize there's not a one size fits all to expense management. Your needs and wants are going to vary either individually but also by situation, location, or over time. So what someone needs in Chicago may differ from what someone needs in Champaign-Urbana or Springfield or Rantoul. So obviously we're focused in Illinois. I know people that that aren't from Illinois may not recognize all of the places that we're mentioning, but those are some different rural areas compared to Chicago within Illinois. But again, there's different budgeting templates out there and they use different terms to refer to expense categories. They might have essential needs or discretionary spending or financial goals as broad categories, but they might use other terminology. And if one doesn't work, you're not a failure, right? Just try some other method until it sticks. Or if you've been doing it one way for a really long time and it's no longer working for you, it's okay to let it go and try something different. That can be really good for overcoming some of the barriers to financial planning. So when it comes to categorizing and prioritizing your expenses, I know we already mentioned, Nikki did a great job of explaining what fixed, flexible, and occasional is. You also want to pay attention to the context of your needs and your wants, so that you can make more informed choices, right? If you have a job change or a family change, your needs and wants are going to shift, obviously. And you also want to make sure that you're recognizing that your personal values influence what's defined as a need. There's not like a grand list somewhere that says these are all needs and these are all wants. That even within the basic needs research field, there's a lot of variance in how basic needs are defined when we're trying to understand financial scarcity and poverty and all of those things. It's also important to recognize that priorities are going to change as our roles and life circumstances evolve over time. What's a need for you is not going to be necessarily a need for me, right? So we need to keep that in mind, especially when we are sharing financial responsibilities with someone else. Discussing our values and what's important to us can help us better define shared needs and talk about what to prioritize. So those are just some things that I wanted to remind you of. So when it comes to different ways to track your progress or your expenses, there's the envelope budgeting method. This is a little bit more old school. This is where you have different envelopes for different categories of spending. So that's why you need to categorize your spending first. Then you put enough cash in that envelope to cover what you anticipate to spend that much. The trick is that once you run out of cash, you are done spending in that category for that month. This is also pretty risky, so there is an electronic version of this method. I think the app is called Good Budget. And this is where you set your spending limits electronically and then manually record your purchase amounts in the app as you spend throughout the month. And this is probably a little bit safer way of setting spending limits than carrying a whole spending budget around with you in cash for an entire month, or even putting it in your desk drawer, right? Calendar budgeting is where you use a calendar and you might color code expenses so you can anticipate what bills are coming up or what expenses are coming up. For example, rent, utilities, car payment, credit card bill. But also you can think about your friend's birthday party or going to a concert, and you can also set up payday alerts in your calendar so you know when there's going to be money being deposited. So it's basically kind of a visual supplement to tracking your money more explicitly and other methods. So you might use a combination of these methods. Spreadsheets and other electronic methods are very popular. There's a lot of ways to automate some of the tracking methods with these kinds of electronic tools. There's a lot of smartphone apps out there that can help you track expenses like we've talked about before already. Your financial institution might already be doing this for you, so checking if that's available and how to better utilize it might be a cheap, right, and an easy way to do that. Whatever app or online banking that you choose to use, make sure that it does have bank level security if it allows connection to your accounts. This is called financial aggregation. And you want to update it regularly to avoid any security issues if you are using electronic methods. And then there's also pencil and paper, right? If you're not familiar with the concept of a check register or balancing your checkbook, this is basically the method of physically writing down all your purchases and comparing it to your bank statements at the end of the month. But it also gives you an opportunity to categorize some of your spending so that you can make more informed choices on your plans. All right, so the good news is that with all the apps that are out there, you can try different ones that work for you. So there's a lot of different reputable apps. We're not going to mention any specific ones because there's a lot of liability with that, but there's things that you want to keep in mind. So you can use them to categorize expenses. You want to look for tools that make this easy for you to do. They can aggregate all your accounts in one spot. A lot of them, not all of them do this. So if you don't want to connect to your financial accounts, look for ones that don't rely on that to help you with your expense tracking. You can also track things like your net worth. Um, they can suggest spending categories or income categories to help you track that. You can also set up a budget or spending plan. You can sometimes set goals up and track progress to your goals, which can be really motivating. You can get alerts when you're over budget or some of your goals are achieved. But it's really important, especially now, that you are being cognizant of free trials ending. So if you're trying out a budgeting app, in my house, we recently had to switch after a tool that we were using that was ad supported is no longer available. And so I tried to focus on just using one at a time during the trial period before we made a decision on which one we were going to use that worked best for both of us, that we're tracking expenses using an electronic method. So keep that in mind. All right, so there are tons and tons of different budget strategies and templates and philosophies out there. So we're just going to highlight a few of them coupled with some apps that have features that seem to align well with each of the strategies or philosophies that we have listed. I do want to premise this with we have not physically all used these tools ourselves, so you need to do your own due diligence when it comes to seeing if it will work for you and what types of disclosures are in place for these apps and how they use your information. So the 50-30-20 rule we'll talk about in more in depth later is something that was introduced by Elizabeth Warren and her daughter, when they wrote about this in their book, All Your Worth, the Ultimate Lifetime Money Plan. This is where 50% of your net or after-tax pay is for essential needs, 20% is for financial goals, and that includes either saving or paying down debt. And 30% is for wants or what they call discretionary spending. So we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but that is one option. And there's a few budgeting apps that might align well with 50-30-20. Zero-based budgeting is by Peter Pyer. And we think that there's a couple zero-based budget apps that align with that. This is where every expense needs to be justified. So when you subtract all your expenses from your income, it equals zero. So in this method, you give every single dollar a job. And it's really similar to business accounting in a lot of ways, so that you're basically tracking your cash flow very well and you're assigning it to what your goals or your financial responsibilities are. There's also the mental accounting or no budget budget, which was introduced by behavioral economist Richard Thaler. It builds on that research. There's pay yourself first, obviously, as a philosophy. There's the 60% budget solution, and we also have traditional budgeting systems. So you take your annual net income and subtract your monthly, quarterly, and annual expenses from it. But this requires you to track your actual income and expenses and adjust your estimates for the next pay period based on what actually happened, which really you should be doing with any budgeting system or philosophy that you use. We did a podcast episode in depth on all these different budgeting strategies that Emmy has shared in the chat if you want to check that out. All right. So, Nikki, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about setting goals.
Thanks, Andrea. So as Andrea said, we're going to talk about setting goals and how that can also build your confidence. So when you visualize and set goals, there is a behavioral economics concept. It's called the implementation intentions. And it basically identifies that people are more likely to do something when they specify how, when, and where they will do it. So we can use SMART goals to help us identify those for your financial priorities. So SMART, the S in SMART is specific. So you could use photos or symbols that represent your goals. M, measurable. So make sure you're researching and identify the cost of your goal so it's realistic. And you may want to use different separate savings accounts for different goals. That's a personal decision. A, agreed upon. So if you have others that are involved in your financial goals, make sure that you are talking to those who are involved. That could be a roommate, it could be a significant other, whoever it might be. Are realistic. Look at your income, your expenses, your other goals, and make sure that your goal that you are setting is actually achievable. If you set a goal that, given your life, right, your income and your expenses, and you try to set a goal of you're going to save $5,000 by the end of 6 months, like if it's not something that can be achievable, it's just going to frustrate and drag down that confidence. So make sure that they are realistic. And then timely. Time goals should be set, but remember again the flexibility factor.
Okay, the hour of 4 p.m. having arrived.
I am
The House
so
Executive
sorry.
Committee shall come to order. I do
Hold
have
on
in my
second.
Sorry about that interruption. As Nikki is dealing with that, just keep in mind with SMART goals to be flexible with what your needs are. Are you back, Nikki?
I am back. I apologize. I had no idea that was still up on my computer. I thought I had shut all my windows down. Anyway, so just make sure that you are flexible based on your changing priorities. So setting an emergency saving goal. This is often, I'm going to be honest, this is always my biggest source of anxiety when we start talking about finances. The goal is to set aside 3 to 9 months of essential expenses in an easy to get format. That could be, so essential expenses, again, those needs versus wants, rent or mortgage, utilities, etc. Again, make it a SMART goal and set milestones. Start small. Most Americans can't cover a $400 surprise expense without borrowing. So again, start small and then keep going. Once you can save up for 3 months, then try for 6, but start small. And then make sure you're saving securely. So that means an FDIC or a NCUA, which is the credit union's insured financial institution. Make sure you keep those funds liquid, but not as easily accessible, so you don't, you're not tempted to spend it. Timing of your savings goals. So a big component of prioritizing your SMART goals is to determine the time. And that can help you to identify whether it is a immediate, short-term, midterm, or long-term goal. Most of us have more than one goal and timeframes may vary. So prioritizing your goals when you create your budget is important. And you may need to readjust your goals as time frames change. So as you're sitting here thinking to yourself, can you think of examples of each type of goal? Immediate, something that you need within a few weeks, less than a year, near future, 1 to 5, intermediate, usually about 5 to 10 years, and then long-term, 10 plus years. There are many different ways to prioritize multiple goals. And again, most of us have many goals, but that means that there are a lot of opinions too. And we could give you some common suggestions on prioritizing your multiple goals. But again, this is going to play into what works best for you and your priorities and beliefs. So common suggestions include establishing that emergency savings, which we talked about, contributing to retirement. You may want to maximize any match your employer offers and take advantage of any compound interest. Paying down high interest debt. High interest is typically considered anything higher than the current average federal student loan or mortgage rate. Right now, mortgage rates are around 6.5%. So anything above that would be considered high interest. So you'd have to look at your credit cards or any other things that you may have taken a loan out on to see. Make a list of other goals to consider, including total cost, time frame of need, and tools to help you reach those goals. And as always, if you need more help, consider hiring a financial professional. And there are, lots of resources available to you by your university or community as well. I'm going to turn this back over to Andrea to talk about this.
Thank you so much, Nikki. So I just launched a poll. So what we want you to do is pick one of the photographs that best represents what you want your financial well-being to feel like in the future. Do you want to feel like a beach or a heart hands, holding hands with someone? Do you want it to feel like keys or stepping stones? And why? So the reason that we're doing this is because there was some research done by the Common Sense Lab at Duke for financial coaching. And what they found is that people that used these visual representations of what they wanted their financial well-being to feel like in the future were more motivated to stay engaged in financial coaching to help them reach their goals. So if you find some visual trigger that can help you stay grounded in reaching your financial goals, that can help be a motivator for you. So just think about that as you're thinking about your goals and what you want your future financial well-being to feel like. And when we've talked about financial well-being in the past, there's different ways that it has been framed, but essentially it's how you feel about your financial situation. And that can differ for a variety of reasons, but it's not always related to financial health. So some measures of financial health might be you're having a positive net worth or positive cash flow every month, right? But that's different than how you feel. It's how you feel is more subjective, where things like net worth or cash flow analyses is more objective. And we know that financial behaviors are a big part of financial planning and understanding our expenses. So we just wanted to acknowledge that here. So I'm going to end the poll and just share the results real quick so you can see a lot of people wanted heart hands, which kind of makes sense because as we know from our Money and Happiness webinar, relationships are the #1 most important thing to happiness. So I'll stop sharing. If you still see it, you can exit out of it. but let's talk about creating and implementing your spending plan. So we talked about the 50-30-20 guide to budgeting, which was popularized in a book by Elizabeth Warren and Amelia Warren Tyagi. And they identify 50% of your take-home pay goes to essential needs, 30% to discretionary spending, and 20% to financial goals. So we have talked about 50-30-20 in the past, and we used to use consumer expenditure survey data to show how it doesn't work for everyone at all ages or all income levels. So we want to emphasize that this is a guide and not a rigid rule. And the way that we categorized that before was putting obviously retirement, savings, debt management into financial goals. We used for discretionary spending, apparel, cash contributions, like contributing to a subscription service, furnishings, entertainment, education, food away from home. Those were all discretionary spending. And then we put essential needs as housing, food at home, utilities, healthcare, and transportation. But your categories of spending may go into different overarching distributions. So you might put something that wasn't clear in the consumer expenditure survey data was where childcare went, which can be an essential need for some people, but for some people, some families, it might be in discretionary spending. So everyone's different. We got to emphasize that. There was also an article in Time last year that talked about how the 50-30-20 rule might be better today, closer to 60-30-10. So especially in areas in high cost of living, like in Chicago, compared to more southern areas of the state of Illinois. There's been, since 1999, which I think was the first time 50-30-20 was originally introduced, incomes have increased 77%, but one of the biggest items, rent, has also gone up by 129%. So it's not kept up with average income increases. So it's okay if your expenses don't fit into a formula like this, and we need to acknowledge that. All right, so when you are thinking about your spending plans and tracking, remember that spending ratios will differ by age, income, etc. Everyone's situation is different. Your life stage will impact your spending. So someone who is single is going to have different spending than someone who is married, for example, or people that have kids versus those whose kids have left the nest. So you want to consider that. Look at cost of living differences, especially if you're going to move, and prioritizing essential needs like food and shelter first can help you in thinking about your priorities. So gamification is a very popular way to add fun to personal finance activities. And while gamification terminology is outdated in the educational research field, engaging strategies can support financial behavior change. So there are things like reward systems, ways to visualize your progress, like charts and trackers, challenge-based goals like save $500 in 60 days, where there's a time-bound savings challenge, having accountability partners where you share your goals with friends or a partner for mutual support, and immediate feedback. So apps that show real-time spending impacts on goals. Those are all gamification methods. We also need to be mindful that there are apps that gamify things like investing, or give you access to gambling that can increase risky behavior. So focus on tools that gamify things like saving and budgeting instead. So just keep that in mind. We also did a webinar last fall on budget hacks, and we really focused on behavioral economics and how to leverage kind of our biases, our human biases, to better manage budgets and spending plans. So when you think about income, again, don't forget about gift cards. You want to use your credit card, cash back, and points wisely for things you would have already purchased instead of kind of discounting them or thinking of them as a special dollars. You also want to look for opportunities to use credit card benefits that you already have, maybe purchase protection or using it for travel. You might try DIY to save on repairs or other things that you have going on for expenses. When it comes to debt, you want to compare your interest rates and fees so that you can cut costs. Building good credit can help you save not just on your future debt, right? Having a lower interest rate in the future. It also saves you money on things like leases, or saves you money on things like insurance, because the amount you pay for car insurance has more to do with your credit rating than it does your driving record. So there's a lot more you can learn from watching Budget Hacks. I have one more poll I'm going to launch. So do you have any money secrets, or have you ever had buyer's remorse? I know we only have a few more minutes, so I'm hoping we can get through these last few slides quickly. But if you have to leave, we are recording this, so don't feel obligated like you have to stay. All right. A lot of us have some money secrets. And most of us have had buyer's remorse. So that makes sense. I think that's in line. We do need to kind of acknowledge that our spending secrets and fears exist, so we can better address them when talking about money and creating our spending plan in general. All right, I'll end the poll and I'll share the aggregated results real quick so you can see. And then I'll stop sharing. All right, so I'm going to address buyer's remorse first. So there are things you can do. You can try to prevent it. You can try to acknowledge it if it's a pattern, and you can seek support if it is chronic. So some prevention strategies include tracking spending, so you're aware of it, or aware of where there are triggers to impulse spend that might cause buyer's remorse later. You can identify or create barriers to slow impulsive spending. Maybe when you feel that impulse, you know you have to phone a friend, and so that stops you from actually making the purchase, right? If you've made a commitment to phone a friend when you feel like you want to buy something that wasn't in your plan. And then also aligning your purchases with your values by setting clear goals can prevent buyer's remorse, right? You're not going to result in buyer's remorse if the spending that you're doing aligns with your values and you've clearly outlined goals that align with your values. Stress is something that often drives impulsive decision making. And if you have chronic stress, it impedes the amount of self-control that we have, because self-control is kind of a cognitive activity. And if we don't have the cognitive capacity to engage in that activity, it's going to cause impulsive decisions. And sometimes they are ill-informed, and sometimes they're just what they are, right? Sometimes you're coping with stress. We also did a webinar on money and stress and bad habits last spring, which is on our YouTube channel if you want to check that out, to help you kind of identify where there might be stress-related patterns. We also shared in the chat, if you want to hire a financial professional, I'm just going to quickly say financial counselors, accredited financial counselors, are really good for helping you understand your relationship with money and develop budgeting strategies, and they can be there for accountability. If you are wanting to hire a financial therapist, they're better for addressing underlying emotional relationships with money. So they might help you identify transgenerational beliefs that you learned from childhood that may not be serving you well anymore in accomplishing your goals or feeling good about your financial situation. situation. And then if stress and anxiety in general drives a lot of your spending behaviors, you may need to speak with a mental health professional that can help you identify the triggers for that stress or anxiety. So there's a lot of different ways to seek support, and there are lots of tools that you can use to get that support. All right, so in talking about money secrets, excuse me, a lot of people keep financial secrets. So these might be purchases, debt, or secret accounts. And this is called financial infidelity. And it can lead to its own set of issues within relationships. So in our money and happiness webinar in May, we did talk about the importance of good relationships in maintaining happiness. So if this is something that you struggle with, it may be worth addressing that fear or shame motivating the secrets so you can encourage better communication within your relationships. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on money and relationships because that's its own webinar too, which we've also done. But what's important is that you engage in open communication, money conversations that happen regularly and honestly are going to be more valuable than just when things become too tense. You want to discuss things like your financial values, your spending habits, debt, income, and financial goals openly with any partners that you have. You want to avoiding the money talk because it often leads to misunderstandings and conflict. So if you make it a team effort rather than a source of tension, it can help you a little bit. Obviously, we need to acknowledge that there are different approaches to sharing or pooling income. So some people choose to not pool their income, but instead they might divide their shared responsibilities in different ways. For example, some people will have one partner that says, I will cover everything related to the fixed expenses on the house, right? I'll pay the mortgage, I'll pay the insurance, I'll pay, the utilities or whatever. And then the other partner will cover discretionary spending or things that might vary, like groceries or subscriptions or entertainment. You do whatever works best for your situation, but it will require talking about it. There are also really valuable things that come out of identifying shared financial values and goals. Everyone differs, but a lot of people have shared values. That's why they get into relationships with other people. And they might also have some shared goals. So for example, if you are in a relationship, you might be nearing retirement, and it's important that you're on the same page on how you want to spend your retirement with your partner, if that's something that you are currently in a relationship. So that is something to also be aware of. There are power dynamics in relationships when it comes to money. So it's important to acknowledge that money can really become a tool to control others in a relationship, and economic abuse also involves limiting a partner's access to money or controlling spending or preventing them from working, and recognizing where these are red flags, like being controlled about spending or being prevented from employment or having to ask permission for basic necessities is a red flag. So just keep that in mind. And financial transparency and equal participation in decisions helps maintain healthy dynamics, because this can happen in any situation, even if there's a transition over a long period of time. And you also want to discuss practical things like how to handle the shared expenses. What happens if one of you loses your job, and maybe even financial arrangements in case you separate. So for people that are cohabitating, consider writing down agreements since you lack some of the legal protections that married couples have, and you might want to think about emergency funds, insurance, and ensuring that both partners understand the financial situation and have access to the resources if needed. So for example, if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, I don't want my spouse to not know how to pay the utilities. So we have instructions that are shared between us on how to do that, because it would be terrible if all the lights went out. All right, so we're over a little bit. Please feel free to jump off if you need to, but we'll wrap this up. We need to acknowledge that goals will also change based on your life situation and circumstances. So that might trigger having to reprioritize your spending plan. That's where regular check-ins or regular review of your expenses and your behaviors can really help you. And I'm going to hand it over to Nikki to talk about financial empowerment.
All right, so let's go ahead and talk about financial empowerment. There are different money personalities, and there are lots of different personality inventories out there. And sometimes in order to feel empowered financially, it starts with giving a name to your financial tendencies. The Money Harmony Quiz by Olivia Mellon helps you identify your money personality. And these are the 5 that Olivia names. And you could kind of think about what are just by looking at these and the names of them, what their the financial fears of each money personality type might be. I believe we are dropping a link in the chat soon about that takes you directly to this money quiz, and you could kind of see the different questions that are asked. So financial scarcity can lead to financial avoidance, which is avoiding dealing with your finances at all as a way to cope with stress and negative emotions. That avoidance can then create a negative cycle, and it leads to increased financial scarcity over time. So even if you have if your perceived financial control is low, the tendency to avoid financial information increases. So all of these things are connected together, and we want to make sure we break that kind of cycle to help you feel empowered. So one thing that can reduce your anxiety around finances is to have financial clarity. So that means being aware of your finances and providing perspective and direction to focus on. It also means things like concentrating on one piece of your financial puzzle at a time. Don't get overwhelmed by trying to look at everything at once. Make sure you're celebrating your small wins in order to build confidence. Everybody's small wins will look different. It could be saving $20 at the end of the week. It could be saving more than that. Everybody is different. And then the point of this is always to focus on your progress, not perfection. None of us are perfect. None of us do everything perfectly. That includes our finances. So just make sure you're focusing on how much you have grown. So again, we have stages of change theory, and we have, a webinar or a podcast that you could listen to about how to change the theory of, the stages of change theory and how that can be applied to your finances. So just a few last reminders about your spending plan. Make sure you're spending less than you earn. You change your plan to match your needs and your priorities. You're prioritizing your savings to accomplish goals that mean something to you. Track your spending how you choose. It does not matter how you do it, as long as you are doing it, you find something that works for you. Don't forget that your student loans turn into debt later. And then make sure, always remember, communication is key when you're sharing financial responsibilities of any kind. So you may be wondering, what should I do now? My immediate next steps. Here are 4 suggestions. 1, choose one financial fear that you have to address first. Try to select one tracking method this week, by the end of this week, to try. Set just one small achievable goal, and then review and adjust in 30 days. Those are some of your next steps. And now I believe I'm going to turn it back over to Andrea to kind of wrap things up.
All right. Thank you, Nikki. All right. Our next webinar is Future Proofing Your Finances, Career Planning for Uncertain Times on Wednesday, November 12th. If you have not signed up for it, we would love to see you there. We also have a post-webinar survey that you can check out that Amy will add to the chat, and we will also include it in the follow-up email that we send out to all the registrants. You can watch our previous webinars on YouTube. And excuse me, IL Student Money is the channel that we post them to. And I want to thank all of the Get Savvy Webinar Series collaborators for this year, because there's lots of us. And we will stick around for questions. But again, if you have somewhere to go, somewhere to be, feel free to hop off. But I will double check our Q&A, and Kimber, were you keeping track of any questions that we needed to address now?
Andrea, I put in the chat, but I think that we were in a good place.
Okay. Okay, excellent. We had one Q&A question about showing an example of how to do 50, 30, 20. So I think it was very, very quick, but I did show how we categorized for some of our previous webinars discussing 50, 20, 30. All right, so we use these categories. Your categories might be different to distribute across the 50, 30, 20. So again, 20 is for financial goals. This could include buying a boat, saving for retirement, saving for your first house. It could include paying off your credit card debt. All kinds of financial goals can go in the 20%. Discretionary spending, we used apparel, cash contributions, furnishings, entertainment, education, and food away from home as our categories, but you might have more specific categories. Like maybe you spend a lot of money on plants. I do. And so I have a whole category in my tracking software just for fun money, and I tag it with plants. So it's in that category of fun money, but I like to know how much I'm spending on plants because it might become a problem. And if it becomes a problem, I need to identify that. And then we had for essential needs, housing, food at home, utilities, healthcare, transportation. If you have children, childcare would probably be an essential need, unless you have one of the partners or one of the parents is staying home and taking care of the child. And then it might not be as much an essential need as it is discretionary spending, like if you want to go on a date. But Nikki, do you have anything else to add in trying to implement 50, 30, 20 or 60, 30, 10?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. I would say just that essential needs piece, depending where you live and what stage of life you are, that may expand. So for example, for me, like childcare is part of an essential need, but that's not the case for everybody. So just make sure you're looking at all of your essential needs.
Absolutely. And it differs and it changes over time. That's why this is an active kind of life skill that has to be developed. And it gets more challenging as you get older because you have more expenses and it's harder to prioritize. That's why starting when you're younger can help you build confidence for when you need it. All right. Did we get any private questions? Sometimes I get direct questions sent to me. I don't have any others that were specific to me. Nikki, did you get any private messages?
I did not.
All right. So everyone, if you didn't have lunch while we were talking at you, please go have some lunch now. It was wonderful that you were very active in the chat and very responsive to our polls today. We will do our best to get the captions edited and this recording posted to YouTube probably next week. It will take us a little bit to edit the captions so that they are accessible. But we will make sure to include all the information and all the things we shared in the chat in that follow-up email. And don't forget to register for our next webinar on career planning for uncertain times, which I'm very much looking forward to myself. Thank you and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.